Fog lay over the god's eye like spilled milk, thick and secretive, swallowing sound so that hoof and harness spoke in whispers, and the lake's low lapping might have been a sleeping thing's breath. Harrenhal rose from that pale shroud not as a castle but as a memory cut from black stone, all jagged silhouettes and burned hollows where windows had been. The 5 ruined towers were teeth against a colorless sky, and the ravens that circled them wheeled like ash flakes caught and sent aloft again. Jon Snow drew his mount to a halt upon the rutted lakeside track, and for a moment he let the horse's slow exhale ghost before him while he looked. He had been told since boyhood that Harrenhal was cursed, that the very walls remembered the fire that ate iron and rock and men, and that misfortune nested in the crannies of its ruins like swallows. He had laughed at ghosts when he was small in Winterfell's warm halls, and then learned better on cold nights atop the wall. Curses were only names men gave to their own cruelties. Still, the sight of the keep put a weight on his chest as if he breathed the same old smoke that had once burned here, and his thoughts turned unbidden to green flames leaping like foxes along the Blackwater, and to whispered tales of clay pots stacked beneath a city by a mad king who would have cooked them all in the end. Davos Seaworth rode up beside him, hood thrown back, frost snagged in his beard like salt gone pale. 7 save us, that's a grim pile if ever I saw one. The old gods too, Jon said. Both should have leave to watch what we do here. Davos's eyes flicked over the black spires and the squat, scorched curtain walls, taking in the dead giant's breadth of the place. Harren built his sin large enough for any god to see it. Jon nudged his gelding forward. The road bent between hawthorn and alder, their branches bare and holding a tremulous lace of rime. All along the shore lay fallen reeds shattered by frost, and beyond them the lake stretched gray and wide, the Isle of Faces a darker smudge afloat upon it, ringed by winter-bleached trees. He had never set foot there, nor had he ever seen anyone try. Men whispered that the green men watched from those leaves, and that the weirwood's carved eyes were older than iron. He found his eyes sliding toward it and away again. There were older bindings than any parchment or seal. The gatehouse of Harrenhal gaped like an old mouth without teeth. They passed under it in a murmur of hooves and creaking leather, the wind threading through arrow slits to sing a cold song. In the yard, men moved like midges in the fog, grooms leading horses whose breath plumed white, a flat-nosed armorer squinting at a rivet, a boy with a wicker basket of rushes and the desperate look of someone told to carry out a task too many times for his fingers' liking. The stink of a great place, old smoke, old piss, wet stone, horses, had settled deeper here, layered by years. Lord Tyto's Blackwood met them upon the cracked flagstones, a grave man in a black cloak lined with red, a raven stitched upon his breast. He had a scholar's face, all angles and thoughtful corners, and he bowed as if bricks could draw breath and were honored by it. "My Lord Snow," he said, "or is it King in the north? The songs are not all in agreement." "I am Jon, and I am no king," Jon said. He was weary of that question and of men's need to fit him in some maid-of-words chair. "I come as a man sworn to seek an end to a kind of fire." Tytos nodded once, as if approving a line of text. "Then Harrenhal is apartment. The Wailing Tower has found its voice again, with all the wagons and boots and arguments. You draw men as flies to sheep's eyes." His gaze slid past Jon to where Davos sat his horse with the patience of someone who had weathered so many lordlings' courtyards as to be inured. "Lord Davos, my hall is yours." "And mine yours," Davos said with an awkward soldier's courtesy. "The place looks better from inside, I hope." "Not much," Tytos said dryly, "but there will be bread and broth, and a fire that burns the red way." He turned then and led them toward the Hall of 100 Hearths. The name was a lie now, Jon saw. Where once a lord's cooks might have spit 15 boars at once, now half the hearths were mounds of char, and the rest gaps where stones had fallen when heat made them ring like hands and crack. But men had done what men always did, made do. A portion of the hall had been fenced from the rest with timber walls, and within it was a hearth big enough to warm a dozen. Trestle tables had been dragged there, benches mended, the smoke drawn up by a chimney that had once been a slit in the stone and was now braced wide with iron bars like ribs. They ate, and warmth moved through Jon's bones in steady inches. He watched the room while he chewed, the way a dog at a hunt might watch the brush for stirrings. Over by the fire, a knot of river lords in plain wool argued the price of oats and who had stolen whose hens 3 winters ago. At a lesser table a woman laughed and clapped a swaddled baby to her shoulder as if to drum burps from it. Men wore colors, pale bled versions of them, as if the fog had chewed all banners gray, and a squire went about filling cups with a thin ale that tasted of iron and age, and not of much else. When Jon's eyes lifted, they found the mended gaps in the ceiling, where frost had crept in spiderweb veins along mortar, and beyond that the mind's picture of green fire gnawing these stones, and he had to shove the thought away as one pushes a hand back from a flame. He had thought, upon first giving Davos his wish, that the lords would refuse him. He was too young and too northern, with no right to call such men to any peace not made of steel. Yet the letters had found lodgings in ears as raw as their hearts. Men were tired. The last years had eaten livestock and sons. They had gnawed borders down to bones and left all sides bloody. There was a hunger for anything that promised an end to one kind of burning. By nightfall the first of them had arrived. Ser Adam Marbrand wore a Lannister crimson that looked almost black in the hall's light, and carried himself as a man who had seen a dozen sieges and expected to see a dozen more. Behind him came Lord Jason Mallister, tall and grayed, with a bearing that belonged beneath open sky and mast, not stone. He clasped Blackwood forearm to forearm and spoke with that quiet cadence of men from the sea. After them a bristle of frays, their faces a field of pale mushrooms, their banners muddied in the road, their smiles too slim. Lothar Frey, the one they called Lame Lothar, watched everything with eyes like dull pewter, and his cousin Walder Rivers stood off a step, bastard red in his cheeks and a complacent malice like oil upon water. The Brackens arrived with swagger and scowls in equal measure, and the noise in the hall swelled and chopped, as river water does just before rapids. Jon took a corner place near a brazier that coughed more smoke than heat, and let men come to him or not. He had worn no crown, nor any sword made singable by a bard's tongue. He wore dark wool and a wolf pin and the quiet of someone who had learned to weigh what to say by the cost of lives. In that quiet, faces came to him, some chin-up proud, some wary, some with the look of men who play with knives at feasts. He gave them names, and the names he gave himself weight. Blackwood's Leechhold and Bracken's Pride and Mallister's Salt and Marbrand's Iron. He spoke little but listened, and in listening gathered threads. He found Tyto's Blackwood at his shoulder like a raven that had learned to perch. "The phrase do not come empty," Tytos murmured, his eye following Lothar's careful limp. "When a rat smiles, it has found grain." "Perhaps they've found bread that belongs to another," Jon said. "Perhaps they carry fire," Davos added, grim as a reef. "The rills sent none, what did House Ryswell care?" But White Harbor's men flew the merman in with an escort fat in furs and laughter, and Lord Wyman himself came with them in a litter borne by 4 men whose faces had known better days. He smelled of cinnamon and roast pigs even in a winter courtyard, and his hand swallowed Jon's in a warm tide. "My boy," Wyman boomed, and then seemed to see it was no boy at all who stood before him but a man wearied by duty, and his booming gentled to a base prayer. "A pact has meat in it if it is cooked well. I have brought cooks and parchment, and men who do not mind the bite of cold on their fingers when they must make a mark." His eyes slid like fish to where the phrase sneered among themselves. "And I have brought a knife to peel away what should not be swallowed." From the Vale came Jon Royce in bronze-etched armor that seemed to carry its own weather with it, and with him a handful of green-cloaked knights with faces like tight-shut gates. Royce met Jon as if they had been agreed upon in a room without walls, long ago. His handclasp was dry and steady. "I will not name you what you will not be named," Royce said in that voice of stone upon stone. "But if this is to be done, it should be done in sight of old trees and edges. I have no love for what burns the world without wood to feed it." "Anders Ironwood of Dorne," a clear-voiced herald cried later, and in came men with sun and spear sewn upon their winter cloaks and the stance of those who take long looks before they move. Ironwood had eyes like dark wine poured into calm cups and held Jon's gaze without flinching. "My prince prefers patience to flourish," he said. "But there are some games where the table must be carried into the square to remind folk there is a game at all." By the time the day had turned from iron gray to merely black and the torches had burned down to smoking stubs inside their iron cages, the hall held enough pride and grievance to salt a feast for a year. Jon slept in a chamber that the stewards swore had been a knight's once, and that now hosted only draughts and the scratches of mice. He lay awake longer than he wished, listening to the castle's night talk, stones settling like a tired back, a wind-struck shutter chattering its teeth, men whose dreams sent their tongues to someone's name. The curse, he thought, was only that a place like this remembered, kept the sounds like a miser keeps coins. They began in earnest the next day. A platform had been erected of rough-hewn boards in the hall of 100 hearths, and upon it a table, not the great board of a king, but a sturdy piece worked by some honest hand for counting ledgers rather than feasting, its top a field of scars. Jon took his place at its center, Davos at his right and Tytos Blackwood at his left, as if between shore, river, and sea. Behind them, bundled scribes laid out parchment and coiled strings of sealing wax. To either side gathered the lords and lordlings. The knotted ropes of their old hates hung upon them like chains. Jon stood when the murmurs had settled into a strained hush. He did not raise his hands like a priest, nor strike the boards with a pommel like a commander. He only stood and let his voice be flint, not steel, a stone that sparks when struck. "My lords," he said, "and all who serve them, you know why I called you. The fires we've lit in these years have warmed no one. We have burned fields and sons and oaths. We have set cities to smoldering for a day's triumph that goes to ash in a night. We are tired of smoke. And there is one fire only that hungers for us all." They knew its name before he spoke it, yet some of them shifted as if the word itself burned. "Wildfire," Jon said, "green as envy and old as madness. It eats stone. It drinks water. It remembers cities." Halene the pyromancer had come, though no one had called him. Perhaps the ravens carried the smell of any fire they smelled back to their masters. He stood near the front, his robes a lurid green that looked sick under winter light, and his beard neatly oiled. Men called the leaders of his guild wisdom as if wit were an ingredient in their jars. His eyes were clever and eager both. Now he bowed, a strange little bob with hands gathered before him like a mummer's offering. "With respect, my lords," Halene said, in a tone that drizzled honey and vinegar both. "It is a gift. When used with care under wisdom's hand, it is a tool that wins battles, protects a city, drives off those who would sack and rape and pillage." "At the Blackwater," Davos said, quiet, and men could feel the scar of that name in his mouth. He had come home from that furnace missing for sons. In some lights, the stumps of his fingers seemed a line of burned candles. "At the Blackwater we lost fathers and sons, and the river burned as if the gods had spilled emerald oil. A tool, wisdom, Halene? A tool for men who would ask oiled beards to pour fire for them and then never wash their hands of it." "I am not unsympathetic to grief," Halene said. The words turned and polished so that no edge cut him as he spoke them. "But grief builds poor walls. Wildfire is not flame run wild. It is prepared with rites older than your oaths. It is made, measured, and mastered." "It is not mastered," Jon Royce voiced, his words like stones being stacked. "Nor is the making of it a rite any god smiles upon." "The seven used fire," Halene countered, spreading his hands. "Have you not seen candles lit in a sept? The stranger's hand is not always in it." "That is like calling lightning a taper," Tytos Blackwood murmured. "And that is like telling a river it runs at your permission." Jon let them speak and then raised his voice again. "You may argue the shape of the flame all day. I am calling you to name what it does to us. We keep it in pots beneath our beds and benches like hoarded venoms. It sits in cellars while boys play above, and in ships while men pray above, and in gatehouses while women carry bread over them. I say this, it has no place under our roofs, nor under our streets, nor under our cities. Not made, not kept, not used. Not by old kings, not by new ones. If the Iron Throne requires defense, let it be by men and stone, not by green demons." He let the word hang. hating himself a little for the mummer's trick, but knowing too that sometimes a word must wear teeth to be heard. I ask you to swear by old gods and knew that this is an end. Surrender any that you have. Abjure its making. Put down that kind of power, and we all sleep easier. You ask, bastard. Walder Rivers called, voice heavy with bastard of Fry smugness. As if the thing were as simple as a winter's vow. Who keeps it then? Who checks that another lord has not hid 3 jugs beneath his nursery's floor? Will you send your wolves to every cellar? And who punishes if a man's jar is found? Will the North hang his wife when her kitchen is ash? The faith, said a voice from the second rank, and men made room for a tall septon to ease forward. His robe was clean but patched many times, and his face bore the weather of road and sermon both. The faith has a long memory and longer arms. We cabined sword from altar once, though the swords grew up in every lord's hall thereafter and wanted no reminding. But if a thing is named sin, men will hide it less proudly. He glanced at Jon, then Helene. Swear on the Father's face if you are a man of the 7, and let the Mother's mercy drip down your back like cool water while you put your jugs on a cart. The Citadel knows it best, said a man with the chains of learning around his neck, iron and black iron among them. Iron for warcraft, black iron for ravenry. His ringed hands were cracked, as if he had forgotten gloves in some recent cold. We have kept tallies. We know where guild houses stand, and how many apprentices pass their doors. We know what ingredients the guild buys in bulk. He glanced at Helene with something like pity and something like disdain. We can watch, and we can report. Helene sniffed that note in the air and went to meet it with a ladle. The Citadel knows what it is told, he said. The faith knows what it is shown. You all eat the bread baked by other men. We are those bakers. Without us, bakers feed men. Wyman Manderley boomed from the rear, thinking perhaps more quickly than he appeared to. You would feed the ovens. Lothar Fry raised a hand and let its tremor be read as age rather than anything else. We are to swear that our enemies will restrain their worst weapon, and in return we receive a parchment with seals? A vow is a fine thing to frame above a hearth, where the children can admire it as their father burns with all the others. He smiled as if he had told a small joke at no one's expense but the heirs. Forgive me, but I have seen vows broken by better men than we. Jon looked at him until the smile went thin. This is not the same as vowing to be kind when hungry, Lord Fry, he said. This is putting out a fire we started in the corner because we did not trust the dark. It has grown too large for our corners. It will take a house someday that should not burn. If you mean to say you will not stop keeping jars because your neighbor will not stop, show us all now that you value your neighbor's folly above your own children's beds. There was a long stillness, made of men measuring whether pride was a price they were willing to pay in this hall. After a time Jason Mallister stirred. I have no jars, nor have I ever. We fought raiders with wall and watch and steel. If it is a thing that eats stone and floats burning upon water, may the stranger have it. I will put my name to it. So will Blackwood, Tyto said, as if entering a detail in a ledger. So will the bronze of the veil, Jon Royce added. Anders Ironwood's mouth made a line like a horizon viewed from the deck. Dorn does not keep it, he said. We have sun enough. Perhaps even we remember old tales of a king who loved a prophecy of burning too well. I will take your parchment to Sunspear with my mark upon it, and speak for it. Phrase and Brackens moved at once and backward both, like crabs startled by a light. Helene drew breath, the kind of thin, angry breath of a man who thinks his cleverness has been misread as poison. Adam Marbrand rolled his shoulders as if shaking wet from a cape. I'll not sign for Casterly Rock or the boy, he said bluntly. I am no lion's hand, and my lord uncle's blood was not cold long in the September when the little birds pecked him to death. He cut a look at Jon as if measuring a blade by eye. But if my house feels flame on its face from this green hell because another lord broke a vow, I will not keep the vow's word over my people's lives. You know this. We all know this. We do, Jon said. A parchment does not put out fire any better than will does. But if we carry no water at all, then we are only waiting for something to burn. Swear, and we can cut off its head by watching the places it breathes. If we do not, it will crawl." He let a breath out. "And if one of us breaks this and burns a city, then all who swore can reckon with him. Under 7 and under trees." The talk went to rules then, and to the little matters that fatten such agreements until they are too heavy to pick up. The citadel's counting of jars and guild houses. The faith's right to search certain cellars under certain keys. The penalties for the pot found under the wrong floor. Manderley wanted it written that any man who used wildfire would be driven from any league and trade in the north and the ports of White Harbor, and Mallister asked that the same be true on the Trident's banks. Bracken and Blackwood argued over who would appoint watching men in their lands, lest the other put his eyes in the wrong place. Tito's dry as old bread. Load Jono's Bracken his measure of pride, if only because it cost him less than the argument would. "He will seat his own men to count your jars," Tito said, "and you will seat yours to count his. There we have balanced suspicion." Bracken glared and scrubbed a mark upon the table as if it had harmed him, but nodded. Halene's face grew more waxen with each clause. At last he shook his head in a little angry arc, like a child trying to fling off rain. "This will ruin us," he said, and his voice trembled with something that might have been real grief. "Our knowledge will be wasted. Our guild will starve. Our wisdom will be mocked in alleys by those who slap at flames with wet cloaks. If wildfire is no more, then what are we?" "Safe," Davos said, not unkindly. "Or hungry. Better hungry than burned. I have seen enough hunger to know it is kinder than fire." They broke at noon, and the smell of boiled beef followed men into the yard. Jon stepped out to the winter light because the hall's heat had turned sour in his nose, and because the god's eye drew at him with an old rope. He crossed the yard and went through a gate that had lost a leaf long ago and now leaned like a broken jaw. The gods would crouched beyond, less a garden than a scarred tangle of black trunks and dead leaves, with hoarfrost on last year's briars. The weirwood stood near the water, its pale bark scabbed in places with old burns that turned its face into a thing half seen and half scar. It had a mouth as they did, and someone had cleaned fallen leaves from around its roots. The lake lapped close by, a soft patient sound. "You come for counsel," said a voice that seemed to belong to the frost. Jon turned and looked for a man where there had been none. A figure had stepped from willow shade as if willow shade were a robe. He was short and lean and carried a reed staff taller than he was, and the leather of his clothes had been cured with something that smelled of wet earth and a sweetness Jon could not place. His eyes were a green that did not belong to a house's colors. "You know me?" Jon said, not sure if it was a statement or a question. "I know the look of a man who has made an oath crosswise to another. It stretches him thinner than ice in a thaw." The man's voice held the low music of the next marshes, a slow song given to reeds when the wind comes from the sea. "I am Howland Reed." Jon had known he might come. He had hoped it, as one hopes for a word from a father long dead, and feared it, for sometimes words from father's friends carry the weight of bones. "My lord," Jon said, and bowed, though the man wore no ring and his only crown was the bare willow above him. "I am bound and unbound both. I have sworn and broken without meaning to. I would bind something now that needs binding." Howland Reed's face was not old, but it had that look some faces get, as if they have looked at old things so long that their skin has learned the habit of stillness. He glanced past Jon to the weirwood. "Wall man, king man, boy with wolf, the tree has watched you," he said, "and the water has seen the color of your thoughts. Not green, not that. White, and the gray of something you cannot name." He touched the weirwood with the back of his fingers, respectful as a son touching a mother's wrist. "Bind them here if you would bind for good. I mean to be as much in sight of the Father as of any face here," Jon said. "But yes," he likened the pact to a net. "It would catch more if knotted at more places. Will you witness?" The man dipped his head as one might to a child made serious by a sudden chore. "I will. The greenseers are old, and their thoughts are smooth like stones rolled in water. I am no such. I am only a man who knew your father. But I will watch. And when men break, I will send word with the wind. Jon felt something he had not let himself feel in years. A child's relief at an older hand's promise, and turned away before it could sit too plainly on his face. The Isle of Faces was a thumbprint of darker mist. Do they watch? They watch always. They remember the last midnight fire here that cracked the stones, so they still ache on mornings that promise snow. Do not bring more such for them to watch. Howland's gaze flicked toward the hall as if he could see men inside through black stone. There are those who mean to. They carry pots in under lard and cabbages, and a rat did not eat holes where they mean them to be. How do you know? The trees told me, Howland said simply, with a little smile at Jon's expression. And a frog. And because when men fear that their skill is going to be called wicked by a room of lords, they hurry to show its virtue by making a counterargument that burns. He hunkered, his reed staff across his knees. There is a man among the fry men who smells of Helene's house. He has green wax on the heels of his boots, though he has not stepped in any meadow. If you go down where you should not, take someone's hand. The air near those jars is a skin. Jon went still. The anger he felt rose not like a match but like a cold river, slow and huge and irresistible. He swallowed it as he would swallow fear, because he had learned that to speak in its choke yielded only noise. If they mean to make this place burn with what we aim to end, then the pact must be signed twice as quick. It must be signed carefully, Howland Reed said. Sinners love a fast prayer. He turned the reed staff in his hands, finding his balance upon short legs as easily as a king upon a throne. Harrenhal remembers fire, so do I. Choose a witness of your mother's gods and your father's. Choose winter and summer both. Bind this to more than men who die. Jon nodded, and something at his back, old, cold, seemed to nod with him. Will you walk the hall? I will walk the water, Howland said, and then he was gone so cleanly that Jon was left wondering if the man had been there or he had seen one of those marsh spirits small folk stories named and lords sneered at. By afternoon the parchment had a skin of ink upon it, and men had pushed more spit through their teeth at its lines than a farm boy chews when the weather is strange. Jon watched their faces more than their hands. He could feel where it pulled them, those words. Men felt the pull of punishment and not of right. They feared the neighbor with the locked chest more than they feared the thing inside the chest. The weirwood's face seemed carved to watch fools and heroes both with the same sad mouth. He did not trust to words only. That evening, after a supper that tasted of broth and suspicion, he walked with Davos down a stair whose steps had been worn by men whose feet were older than old. They carried no torch. Torchlight in some places is an invitation to die. A boy with a lantern met them at the third turning. Jon recognized him as the one with the basket of rushes, a lad whose name had been given to him as if from a rolled-up scrap of parchment without thought. Tom. Tom led them along passages that felt like veins cut through a stone heart, until at last they stood before a door swollen by damp. Davos looked at Jon once and then set his shoulder. The smell found them first. Fire has a scent even when it sleeps, a faint sour sweet that makes the back of one's nose itch and then stings the eyes when memory throws oil upon it. This was that, but mingled with something like pitch left to rot and herb gone bad. Jon took a breath through his mouth and regretted that, for it seemed then that taste had learned to smell. He could feel Helene's oiled pride upon his tongue. Inside the chamber 12 jars sat in fat-bellied rows, their clay the color of old bones. In the lantern's careful light the wax on their necks shone not green, nothing so obvious, but an unwholesome yellow with a green thought in it, as if it had dreamed of leaves and woken to mold. Davos went still, and he who had faced burning ships in a river's throat looked for a long slow span of breaths like a man looking upon the bones of a son. 7, he said finally, very quietly. 7. Keep your hands upon my shoulders. Tom held the lantern as if it were a kitten that would scratch but should not be dropped. His eyes were huge in his thin face. I only carry rushes, the boy said in a whisper desperate not to echo. I never. You did rightly, Jon told him. You'll carry more than rushes for this. Go fetch Tyto's blackwood and 2 men he trusts like bread. Tom went, and the 2 men left counted the jars with their eyes and not their fingers. Some were old, the way paper left too long in sun grows brittle. Some were fresh, the wax clean along their mouths. Davos leaned to look and drew back. A man carrying one of those falls, he said softly to himself. And then 10 men die whom he never knew. A lad trips in a stair and a hall burns. And a fool who thinks himself clever lights a wick with a name. The phrase brought them? Jon asked. Or a man brought them to please them, Davos said. Or the wisdoms sent them as a parable. He straightened. Whoever wanted to ruin this wants to ruin you with it, too. If this light's beneath your roof, they call you worse than a fool. They call you a hypocrite. They call the pact a thing cooked over its own fire. Tytos came with 2 of his guards and a 3rd man who wore black leather and had a scar across his cheek like a thrown hook. He took in the jars with a scholar's sorrow. I've known numbers go bad, he said, meaning tallies that turned to lies when a house was hungry, perhaps. But I have not known clay do so. We should take them up, one of the guards said. A big man with the scars that mean a person had once taken up more than one quarrel with the wrong friend. We should not move them, the man with the scar said flatly. Not with hands that tremble from the cold and a boy's lantern. We must not leave them for the man who means to make his sermon from them. Davos looked to Tytos. We need sand. We need blankets. We need... His mouth closed upon some docklord's list that his tongue knew and that he would not speak within hearing of a boy. We need what we need. We need patience, Jon said. The man who brought them will come to see his work. If he is caught with them, we will have more to show men than jars. He turned to Tytos. Post men you have paid from your own purse for 10 years or more. Men who fear your disappointed look. No one else goes down or up here who is not counted. And send for the Septon and the Maester. If I am to be accused of witchcraft tomorrow, let them stand and say I called them as witnesses to the earth's devil. They did not sleep much that night. They drank small beer and watched and waited. Tom dozed on his feet twice and swayed like grass. And each time Davos reached out one of his 4-fingered hands and steadied him by coat and ear both. Down the hall where the jars sat, the air felt not cold but abstaining. Like a room in a house where the dead have lately lain. Somewhere out in the yard a dog howled once and was made quiet quickly, as if a boot had come down or a hand. The mist pressed to the arrow slits, licking. He came in the hour before dawn when some men's courage is a candle stub guttering in its dish and others' courage is the knowledge that nothing in the world sleeps less soundly than guilt. He had that fry look, pale and pocked, the sharp chin, the smile that never rose past the lips, though his surcoat bore only a small badge of twin towers and no quarterings to speak for pride. With him walked a broad man whose steps told their own story. He had walked in a ship once, before he found a landlord's easy pewter. The broad man carried a bundle. Who goes there? Tytos's man with the hooked scar called. His voice quiet and unadorned. A man who knows his voice can do no more work than his arms would save neither by shouting nor by sweetness. Lord Blackwood asked us to fetch candles, the fry-mannered man said easily. His men ran out, and the eastern stair is black as a priest's tooth. He pointed to the bundle. Lord Fry has been generous with wax. We share. Perhaps he has learned to share late, the scarred man said. Set them there. The Fry did not set them. He did not try to push past, either. He held the lift of his chin and the affront his kind always wore like hose wound too tight. I am on my lord's service, he said. You will not. Davos stepped from the shadow that had been his cloak. If you mean to light the wrong thing, lad, he said gently, you'd be wiser to light your own breeches. That way you don't burn all of us when you run. The man with the fry face tried a smile, saw that he had no audience, and tried the swan's innocence next. I carry candles. I could be a septon for how holy I feel. He held up his hands. There was wax upon them in dribbles, and as Howland had said, a smear of it along the heels of his boots. Open the bundle, Jon said, not loud. Who speaks? The broad man challenged, as if rank lay in volume. Then he saw who spoke and no longer wished to be counted as one who challenged. Open it, Jon repeated. The broad man opened the bundle. Candles spilled out, the long pale tallow sort a poor hall uses, and thumped like small bones upon the flagstones. 3 clay pots rolled among them and kissed one another's sides with a little ring like a song made behind a wall. The fry was a man who had no blush, so his blood hid in his throat. "You brought candles to light jars," Davos said. "Forgive me if I do not say thank you." Haleen arrived at the commotion like a fly to meat. His robes swirling with anger, he had not had to pretend into existence. The Septon came too, and the Maester, and Jon Royce in armory that made the hallway smaller, and Jason Mallister with his blade sheathed and his hand upon it in that thinking way some men hold sword hilts when they are thinking hard and do not wish to be seen doing both things at once. Ears gathered, as they do when a story begins, naturally and in the desire to have been present when the punch of it landed. Lothar Frey hovered 3 men back, his limp held like a prayer. "Who brought them and when?" Jon asked. "Where did the wax come from? From whose wagon? Your men will have planted them," the pale man said quickly, too quickly, like a stone thrown too soon in a pond so that the rings it makes are small and obvious, so that you could paint the phrase with it and make yourselves good and us wicked. Wyman Manderley boomed a laugh that had no cheer in it. "You would not need paint," he said. "The color suits you well enough." Haleen folded his clever hands as a host about to explain why his wine was thin and honest and to be praised for that. "This is unworthy," he began. "This is an insult to my guild. Who knows what you have rolled here? Clay is clay. You could fill it with goat's piss and call it ours." The Maester had been bending to the jars meanwhile like a man showing his old back its old complaints. He touched wax to nose delicately and wrinkled that nose. He pressed a fingertip to the clay and then dabbed it upon his tongue, as men who make tables will take a chip of wood and taste it to know from which tree it came. He did not swallow. He spat to the side, a tiny, precise thing. "It is not piss," he said. "It is closer to lie in its way, and to fish that never lived in our rivers. It is what foolishness tastes like when it wants to be admired." "You will not open one to see and prove it," Haleen said quickly, and some men smiled at the gut of fear in his voice. No, you will not, because if you do, then all this talk of your pact goes to ash. This is a trick, my lords, a trick of a bastard who—" "I was a bastard," Jon said, and the smallness of the word like a stone in a boot made him angrier than any slur. "I may be again in your mouth, but this is no trick. This is some man's thought of cleverness, and though I do not know whose thought it was, I will find the man whose hand carried it." They found, in the looking that followed, that a wagon belonging to Lord Walderfrey's contingent had a stain upon its boards that might have been ale, or might have been something else. They found that a boy whose eyes were a blue so pale as to look like new frost upon a puddle had been given coin yesterday to carry a covered jar from one cart to a cellar doorway. The boy had not known enough to be frightened, only enough to be proud for carrying a thing a man had told him was heavy. They found that a man who served Haleen had left the guildhouse in King's Landing 4 days before and been seen on the King's Road in haste. And his wife said he told her nothing, and he had always told her nothing. They found 1,000 pieces that made a picture when laid together so that no man could say it had always been that picture, but only that once the pieces were put thus they made a fox's face and not a dog's. "Punish him," Lothar urged, pointing at the fry-faced man in the hallway, as if he had not been 3 men back when the bundle had been laid down. "Punish him by the law. Prove your pact has teeth." "We were counting its teeth," Jon said. He looked to the Septon. The Septon's jaw was set like a gate hinge. "The law is a door with 2 locks," he said. "The Lord's and the Father's. Both must open to make a passage. You may open yours, or you may tell the Father's man to open his. But we need not drag a man by his hair to show folk that men have hair." "Plain words," Davos said gently. "Do what a lord would do with such a one." Jon looked at the man. He saw no contrition there. He saw the trained cruelty of a petty soul, and the frightened calculations of someone who had expected to stand behind a bigger man when the blow fell. He thought of burning suns, of decks made a street of torchlight, and of men sat upon chairs in a city who thought they could hold a thing like this as if it were a leash. He was not cruel. He had learned, young and hard, that sometimes mercy is the only hand that can undo a knot because the other hand would only pull it tighter. Yet there are some knots that must be cut. This man will lose his right hand, Jon said. The one he meant to put to the wick. He will lose the fingers of his left, so that should he try again he will find only clumsy sin. He will be branded with the sign of the mother's tears upon his cheek, because he thought to make mothers weep, and he will be turned out from any lord's roof who signs the pact. If he lives, he will eat from kindness or not at all. The fry-faced man gasped and tried to turn to Walder Rivers with his eyes as a dog turns to its master with its whole body, and Walder found a buckle to fix his gaze upon. Lothar's mouth made a tiny O of practiced sorrow. If grief were a coin one could mint to pay for meat, Lothar would feed a lord's halls with it and never touch the oven. A hard mercy, the Septon said, and his voice approved without smiling. Helene swallowed. He had the look then of a man who has just been made to look into an empty bowl and told it is dinner. His pride was a thin soup. There was scarcely anything in it to catch a tooth. He drew himself up only so far as his logic would bear. You will do this without proof that it is wildfire? Your guild, said the maester mildly, is full of men who would argue a pot is not a pot if it is turned upside down. He sniffed delicately again as if smelling for the past in the air. Do not make us think the Citadel must write another book with a chapter upon how wisdom speak when they mean to burn the world. I will see it, Jon Royce said, and they all heard in his voice the old ways under stone. I will watch the hand fall. If there is skullduggery here, may the warrior break my arm when I draw next. He looked at Helene. Will your god prevent what you started? No? Then keep him silent. They did the punishment in a yard between towers where old mildew spread on stone like maps of a countryman were better not to visit. The fry-faced man did not cry out, not because he had courage but because his pride was the only clean thing he owned. The winter air took the blood steam and made it witch breath. The men who watched took their faces away as you do when someone should be allowed to keep one thing, their voice or their tears, for themselves. Jon stood apart, and when it was done he felt no triumph. He thought of the stumps of Davos's fingers and felt the old man nearer than any lord had been in that moment. They took the jars from the cellar under heavier guard than a king might put upon his queen at night. They did not open them. They did not compromise with curiosity. The maester and the septon walked before them, chanting each in their way without speaking to one another, and the line of men carrying small death moved through the hall like cautious ants. In the afternoon the parchment was ready. White Harbor's scribe had a hand like little waves, steady, with a pattern that returned upon itself rightly, with a flourish where a tide might break. The Citadel scribe wrote tight, spidery lines like thread in a stitch that closes a wound. Jon watched both and thought that perhaps this was what he had wanted most. Men from houses that would fight in a field for honor making ink scratches together that would keep some child's bed from knowing the sound of fire beneath it. They signed in the hall at first, and then, when the day waned and the hall's air had grown thick with old smoke and the smell of wax, Jon stood and said, "Come outside." He did not explain. He led them through a gate and down into the godswood, where frost had made the world a lace. Men stamped and put hands into armpits and cursed softly, but they came. The weirwood watched them with a patience that made a mock of urgency. The lake was a tilted mirror holding up a piece of sky. "Swear here," Jon said. "If you swear for the 7, we will go to the sept that is set in the next town. I have no wish to make your faith a footnote in my book, but swear here to the old wood, too. The faces do not forget they were once men. They remember. If any man breaks and burns, let the trees whisper his name until crows learn to croak it." There were those who shifted and disapproved. A man from the reach coughed and spat into leaves as if to make sure the tree took the proper measure of his disdain. But Jon Royce put his big hand upon the scarred bark without any song of it, and Wyman Manderley did the same and looked smaller when he did, as big men have a way of doing when they touch something without measure. Tytos Blackwood pulled a knife and nicked his thumb and let a drop fall upon a root. Jon watched the red soak into the root as a raindrop does when the dry earth is thirsty. "Where is your sept then?" Anders Ironwood asked. You promised a father's face as well as a mother's. They rode that evening to the town beyond Harrenhal's shadow, where a sept half-collapsed by years of neglect and war still stood in a crooked way. The stained glass was gone from most of the windows. The faces of the seven were whitewashed or so smoke-blackened as to be one face. A single elder woman was there, cleaning a floor with a cloth and a stubborn vigor like a prayer she had decided to embody. She looked up and seemed almost angry to see nobles in her threshold. "We are shut," she informed them crisply, as if they were boys at a bakehouse door. "We will only borrow your gods for a moment," Jon said. "We will leave them as we find them, and perhaps give them back some of their likings." She snorted, then smiled without meaning to. "They like candles. They like salt. They like men who mean the words they say." The lords filed and crowded under one beam, as if the building had decided to guard them itself rather than trust them to the gods alone. A candle was lit, then 2, then 20, like a slow flock of stars being convinced to gather. Men muttered. Men crossed themselves peculiarly. Men who did not care for that sort of thing stood and let their presence be their prayer. The septon spoke a few words not crafted for lords but for men, a matter-of-fact plea that this vow would stand between boys and burning, and between cities and ghosts. When they pressed their seals to the hot wax upon the parchment afterward, it felt like capping a wound with lint and honey both. By the third day, they had more marks than spaces left. By the fourth, the phrase had set their little seals as well, and Lothar did it as if he were pushing a pig toward a sty, disgusted by what pigs always are. Walder Rivers put his bastard's hand upon it with a little sneer that seemed to be for the very idea of a seal, and perhaps for any hand that did a thing under a winter sky that might thunder back in spring. Helene did not sign. Guilds sign for themselves and kings sign for guilds. He went about with a small cloud of outrage and appealed to men who would not be appealed to. Sir Adam Marbrand signed for himself with that note of conditional loyalty men of his stamp keep in a pocket like a nail they mean to put into a wall when they get home. The day they meant to do the formal, with banners hung not as brag but as identification and a cadence called by a drummer at a soldier's pace. The sky had the hurt look it gets when it wants to snow but knows it will rain. A wind came down the lake and the weirwoods showed their red leaves like wounds that would not scab. It was meant to be the day the hall brightened not with fire but with something like a feast that had survived the slaughter of too many feasts. It was the day the jars woke. Jon knew it first as absence. He was speaking to Ironwood and to Lord Jason Mallister about who would serve as watchers along the river, and the room's noise was the noise of men in their effort and opinion. Then there was a thickening of the air, a pulling down. He had felt that once before when a storm grew suddenly in a clear sky, when the clouds had been hiding beyond the horizon and then came up over it like a great gray army. He felt it again, and his hand went to empty air where Longclaw would have been if he had not chosen to come without a song to his hip. He looked to Davos. Davos was already moving. "Down," Davos said. "Down." They woke. "Who?" Jason demanded, still hearing the talk they had been having in his ears instead of the one that had arrived in the hall. But he saw Jon run and followed, because men who have lived on coasts learn to trust those who fall quiet at the wrong sounds. They reached the cellars like men with their coats afire run toward a pond. The smell had climbed the stairs ahead of the thing itself. The sour again, the sweetness gone rotten, the air with that taste of bad thought. The guards Tytos had set were on their feet and awake, their hands out and their faces numb with the carefulness of men who stand beside a friend's wife in childbed and do not know what to do with their fingers. Behind them the jars sat placidly, pretending to be old clay, and yet there was something in the room that hummed, too low to hear, maybe, but felt in teeth and old bone. Tom had snuck back there again. Tom had that unteachable thing boys sometimes have that makes them go where they must. He stood near the threshold, and his mouth made a little round of terror he was too stubborn to shut. Jon caught him by the sleeve and reached for Davos with his other hand and then stopped, some sense telling him that in rooms where such things sat you did not reach for anything you did not have to. "Who?" the scarred guard asked again, and Jon said, "Not who. What?" They woke. Someone jostled them, or someone lit something, or someone breathed wrong in the world. We must move air. We must. He did not know what must be done. He knew the words he had promised himself he would never be the man to know, the how of it, and yet some understanding rose from the dark of the wall's nights when men had spoken of the old king and his plan as if it were a winter story. He did not speak those words. Instead he said, "Sand," and turned and ran. Men fought a different war in that hour, one that few had foreseen, hauling casks and opening barrels and cursing as they spilled grain upon floor that had seen too much spilled blood. Someone brought blankets. Someone else shoved men back from the door. Someone prayed aloud, and someone else struck him hard across the mouth because the sound was wrong for this. Jon and Davos and the Scarred Guard carried up and carried down. Tyto's Blackwood stood at a foot of stairs and placed men as they came like a soldier at a breach, calm as a bookkeeper who finds coins in the wrong columns and sets them right one by one. Helene came with a scream in his voice. "Do not touch them. Do not." He fell to kneeling beside the nearest jar as if to comfort it. He whispered to it, a lover to his beloved. His hands shook. When he would have put his cheek to its clay, Davos pulled him back by the collar. "You'll burn your face off kissing that," the Onion Knight said tersely. "Wisdom. Stand back and be wise." The jars had been under lock. The lock had not been broken. Yet some hand had other ways to move the world than keys. Jon thought of the candles in the bundles and the wax upon the heel of a boot. "They put a taper in the wall," he said slowly, "where we would not see it. They meant for it to burn down, to touch a thread that burns too slow to notice until it kisses. We slept while a wick ate the night." "Then find the wick," Jon Royce said, his voice level not because he was calm but because he would make it so by force. He came up the stair with a handful of bronze men, and their presence quieted the panic of a dozen at once. "Pull it like a weed." They found it, twine stretched through a drilled hole, then caulked and painted to match the stone. A cleverness a guildsman would teach a boy with a wink, the kind of trick that shows off not its rightness but its maker's pride. Royce put his big hand upon it and pulled it forth, and the end that came through was black with burned thought and hot to the finger. He flung it down and ground it under his boot. "Slow fire," Jason Mallister muttered. "A thing mariners fear. Worse than weather." He looked at Jon, and there was no accusation in his face, only a brittle anger that had no object. "We cannot guard against invisible hands. We cannot guard against what men do when they smile like that. We can guard against ours," Jon said. He felt as if every thought he had weighed in the last days had been thrown up into air like a bucket of water, and what he must do now was catch what mattered before it fell upon hot stones. "We sign now. We sign and we carry the jars to the sight of both gods. And we witness them sealed not by guildsmen but by hands that fear this more than they love cleverness. They will burn if you move them now," Helene said hollowly. "They will burn if they decide to. They do not decide. I decide. I speak to them. I soothe them. I tell them the world is not worth eating today. Do you?" The maester's voice could slice parchment without a knife. "Does your whisper carry into clay? Or does your whisper make you feel like a god in a world where men don't look kindly on gods?" Helene's eyes shone with resentment and something like the dazed sadness of a child whose favorite toy has been put upon a shelf too high to reach. The candles that had been lit in the hall for ceremony still cast their light through the doorway and made his beard's oil a line of gold along his jaw. "You will destroy all we know," he said, as if the words themselves were a binding. "We will destroy what you know of this thing," Jon said. "You may keep the rest of your rituals. Keep what does not make cities ghosts." He turned, lifting his voice so that it traveled up the steps and into the hall where men waited for words to tell them what to do. "My lords," he called, "we will swear now." He took the parchment. He bore it not as a shield or a sword, but as a plank carried across a stream from one bank to another, careful and with both hands. Men made way because men make way when someone carries something he believes in. There is danger in that and grace both. They sealed in the hall, and then they carried the parchment to the godswood and sealed again with a pricked thumb upon a root, and then they rode to the sept and sealed again with wax that smelled of bees and a smoke that the old woman said was made of apple wood. They did not feast between the two. They drank water like penance. When the last seal was pressed, When the last name was made an ink-black oath, Jon looked upon the signatures. They seemed small, so small, names and scratches in a row, normal as anything, unglorious. History dresses itself later. In the moment it wears no brighter cloth than a scribe's patience. They moved the jars then, in a procession that made the hall seem like a church, not because there were gods in it, but because men had agreed to do a thing together. The septon walked before them, a candle in his hand. The candle's flame was the ordinary color of any kitchen's wick. How modest real fire looked, set against what those jars might do. The maester sprinkled ash upon the floor, odd little pinches, as if to make the place remember what it was to be not quite clean, and so not quite fit for a god to make his bed within. They placed the jars upon the stone beside the weirwood, and for a strangling instant Jon feared the sight of the tree and the jars together, as if they would quarrel and he would be the cause of it. He thought of the story of men who had brought iron to a place where iron did not belong and found that the very earth rebelled against it. Then he breathed. He turned to Howland Reed, who had come again without being seen to come, and the man nodded once as if to say, "It is a thing started. Now finish it." Jon walked to the water's edge. Men expect an oration there, perhaps. He had none. He put his hand upon the lake as if it were a thing with skin. It felt colder than anything has a right to be that is not itself alive. "Old," he whispered. "Old as you are, see us." He did not ask forgiveness from the water. Water forgives nothing and everything. He turned back to the jars and said, "Wisdom Haleen, if you know a way to make these less likely to kill us when we sleep, name it now. Name what we can ask that is not a right of making. Name what is caution." Haleen's lips moved. He looked like a man called to speak to a child he had killed. He said something so small Jon had to step closer to hear it. "Cold," Haleen said. "Cold and thick." He could not bring himself to tell the old trick to kill his own craft. His shame was a peasant's hand that would not open for men it hates and knows it should still sell them bread. "Do what is safe to do," the maester offered. "Pack them deep in clean earth, cold earth. Keep watch. Move them in the smallest way possible. Keep men from touching as they pass. Anyone who goes near them must have no gilded belt buckle, no spark upon his person. Do not sneeze." It was not instruction in sin. It was a peasant's advice not to spill a chamber pot in your own bed. They did what men do when the thing before them is larger than their arms. Small things, carefully and with attention that would shame a bridegroom. The jars were cradled, not to be loved but to be kept from waking. They were set where their chill could be borrowed from the world. Men who had done stupid brave things in war moved with a delicacy one usually sees only in midwives and thieves. Howland Reed watched, and when two men stumbled he said one soft word, not to the jars but to the earth, and somehow the stumble did not become a fall. When it was done, when the jars were away from sleeping men and the hall's boards and the laughter that men work so hard to dredge up after shame, Jon let himself sit upon a stone and feel tired as if he were made of wet wool. Davos sat beside him, and the onion smell of him, old salt and leather, was the smell of a different kind of fire put out. "You did something hard," Davos said. "I did something that will need doing again," Jon said. "Men forget. They have their reasons. They make a small cheat for one winter and then find the next that the cheat needs feeding. Then you make a thing heavy enough that when they cheat they feel it upon their chests while they sleep." Davos glanced toward the Isle of Faces. "Your frog lord looked on?" "He did. Then it will be in the water's mouth. And fish have more children than men." That evening, when the sky at last gave up its indecision and sent down flakes big as coins, the hall felt cleaner, as if something had been swept from it that had no business there. Men did not embrace one another. They did not call one another friend. But their eyes did not look always to the corners, as if corners could hide green foxes. The parchment lay upon the table like a loaf of bread. At the end, when all was as done as men can do a thing, they named it. Someone said Harrenhal's peace, perhaps mocking. The name stuck as such names do, something easy and ugly and that men can say without asking too much of their throats. Jon did not care for it. Peace is not what you get when you tell a man to put down a knife. Peace is what you get when a man forgets he wants it. But names are not owned by their makers. Sir Adam Marbrand came to Jon that night and stood like a man who has decided to say a thing and fears that saying it will make a wall he has not decided if he wants. "I've sent a raven to the rock," he said. "I have told them I signed a thing with a northern bastard, and that if the boy king and his mother and whatever men she keeps whispering at her wish to keep jars beneath the streets as a secret, they must keep the secret from me. I have sons." He looked at Jon, the Lannisters' man and the honest man at once, and said, "Do not make me sorry, Snow. Do not sign this and then keep 3 jars in Winterfell for a day when you feel yourself wise enough to know when to open them." "I have no Winterfell," Jon said, the ache of it a familiar toothache he had learned to chew on. "But I will not. If I ever keep a thing like that, let the trees tell you in your sleep until you find me and take my hand from me." "I prefer to keep yours," Adam said, and went. Wyman Manderley toasted the parchment with ale, and then drank the ale anyway because a man who had lived through this much was not a man to waste a thing brewed with patience. "I will go home," he said, "and I will make pies that do not taste of vengeance. I will fill them with lamb and with onion and with fat and with rosemary. And if any man brings me a jar with wax upon it and asks that I hide it, I will bake his head. No, not in a pie. I will bake it upon a pike." Jon Royce clasped Jon's arm with both his hands as men of the Vale do when they mean to be bound. "You have made a cord between houses today," he said. "May it hold when men try to chew it." Tyto's Blackwood gave Jon a curt nod that meant more than it showed. "You managed the mathematics of pride better than most. I will count that as a miracle." Howland Reed came to him once more before he went. "Pacts bind men," he said, looking past Jon into the lake that held no reflection because of how the snow fell. "Trees bind memory. Stories bind children. If you wish this to last, tell it as if it were a story and a shame both. Tell about the boy with the lantern. Tell about the man with the fry face. Tell about how close we came to pouring our own fire upon our hands. Not the Lord's son who stood upon a table with wax. The boy. Let boys fear being that boy, and you will have done more than you did with your knives." "I am no bard," Jon said. "You will be a father," Howland said simply. "All men who lead are. They tell their sons what to be afraid of without meaning to. Make them fear the right things." Jon did not sleep that night either. He stood upon the wall walk when the snow had turned the ruins into a kinder thing than men had made them, muffling their edges, quieting their gossip. The gods' eye was a pale disk, and beyond it the Isle of Faces watched. He raised a hand toward it at last, like a child waving at a distant friend he has not met yet and believes in despite that. He thought, not for the first time, of Winterfell's yard and the way the dead of his house had been carried out of it while the living had carried on because that is what living does. He thought of fire as it should be, tame in a hearth, a red companion in a cold world, and of fire as it should not be, loosed, hungry, a lie that pretended to be safety. He thought of his father's face and his mother's voice as he remembered it only as a feeling and as a whole. In the morning men left. They left in the way men leave a place where they have signed something that will change their wives' kitchens. With relief, with dread, with gossip already catching up like dogs. The Freys left with their lips thin and their eyes quick, and the river's bastard had a new scar upon his pride he would keep in a pocket and touch in the night. It would not make him better. Ironwood left smiling the grave smile of someone who has put a thing in motion and knows it will take a month to reach his prince, who will read and make a face shut as a window in rain and then open it, a little. Mal Lister left with his salt wits already considering what the agreement meant for his boats and the men who load and unload them. How often he must look into a hold for a jar a man might swear is something else. Jon Royce left with a winter upon his cloak and a set to his shoulders like a brace built into a house. Jon stood in the yard and watched them go and felt no triumph. A pact is a thing that lives or dies by men's ability to look themselves in the face afterward. He had given them a mirror. Whether they looked was not his to force. Davos found him in the shade of the gatehouse, where a drip from the stone's lip had made a bead of clear water that fell again and again, slow as wisdom, right at the same place on the flagstones so that there was a small, honest pit worn there. "We will count jars for the rest of our lives," Davos observed. "We will," Jon said. And a boy somewhere will think he is clever and tuck a thing away from his father, and men will die and he will live and hate himself without stopping. Davos's head tilted. We cannot stop all of it. We can stop more than we did. Yes. Jon's breath fogged and he watched it. If a man looks at his breath long, he can pretend it is his soul and measure it. His soul measured no longer than any other man's in that cold. Do you suppose the city will sign? Davos asked. He meant King's Landing and the Boy King and that spider's table where men ate one another in small bites and called it council. Do you suppose they will give up their jars and their guild and the comfort of knowing they have wolves chained beneath their beds? No, Jon said. Not at once. Maybe not ever. But we have told them that if their wolves get loose and bite us, we will not say beasts, as if they were not bitten by men. We will know where the chain was. He looked over Davos's shoulder toward the lake. He was not thinking of kings. He was thinking of a girl's smile that had been a kind of summer once, and of a boy's laughter that had been a kind of spring. He was thinking of the faces that had taught him what right and wrong felt like in the body, and of his own hands learning new weights. He left Harrenhal with the last of his men. Behind them the castle sagged back into its old watchfulness, the snow already softening men's tracks as if a hand were smoothing a bedspread. The godswood stood and the weirwood kept its cold counsel. The lake breathed as lakes do. In the wagon behind them rode the parchment in a chest with a lock that had no key. It was not a thing that needed to be opened now so much as it needed to be kept from foolish fingers. On the road they met a tinker with a cart whose wheels were splayed with the weight of his wares. He had pots and pans and knives and twine, and a row of candles like a small parade. He asked them with a grin like a crack in good bread if there was a fair somewhere he should be going to. For he had heard tell of a gathering of great lords and great oaths and thought that surely such men would still need pans. Jon bought a pan. He paid twice what it was worth and did not tell the man why. He found himself reluctant to say the word again even to a tinker. They camped that night on a knoll where the snow lay thin and the wind spared them its worst. Jon lay in his cloak and looked at the moon between scudding clouds, and at last, when he was sure no one would hear him make words that might be a prayer, he murmured a thank you to any god who listened for this one day. Not for the jars being unlit. Not for the parchment with its gold seals and its lines. For the boy with the lantern. For Davos's hand on a lad's collar. For a frogman's reed staff. For Tytos's ledger eyes. For an old woman's stubborn sweeping at a sept. For everything small and stubborn that had stood between a great hall and green hunger because the small things had decided that day to stand together. He dreamed that night that the hall of 100 hearths burned, and in the dream green fire made the faces of men tallow masks with holes for eyes. He woke with his heart hammering as a smith hammers a nail, and sat up so hard the snow fell from his cloak. He looked at the dark and listened. The only sound was his men's breath and the winter's teeth working quietly at the world. In the morning, he rose before the dawn and walked away from the camp to where the ground fell away in a slow slope. He stood there until Howland Reed stepped up beside him again, as if the man could find him no matter where he went, and did not startle because he had come to expect such things of him. They stood without speaking and looked at the light as it formed itself like bread proving, swelling slow, patient in its own rightness. Will it hold? Jon asked at last, like a boy asking if the raft he made will carry him across the river. Howland tapped the earth with his reed staff once. Does any raft hold always? He said. Sometimes it does one crossing and one only. Sometimes it is found again the next summer by boys who name it for themselves. Sometimes it sinks and a fish lives in it. Men think their raft was built to carry the world and curse when it goes down with only them aboard. The raft carried you yesterday. That is everything and also not enough. I know, Jon said, and he did. You build anyway. He did not know what song would be sung of it, if any. Songs are written for men who win a thing by blood and someone else's good rhyme. He had not won anything, not in any way a man can hold up and say, mine. There would be no crown, and no throne carved to sit his name. He would be called a fool in some halls and a stubborn goat in others. Men who had signed would break that seal and then find ways to pretend their oath had never needed to be kept. He would be called names more bitter than bastard by men who loved such names. Yet somewhere, a girl would grow old in a city and never know why her bed was never burned beneath her at midnight, and a ship's boy would never see a river turn to a lit road that led nowhere but pain, and a lord's clever nephew would never learn a ritual that gave him a god in a pot. He would never know those names either. He preferred it that way. Glory is a green fire too when held too close. When they rode on, the sky had cleared in that brittle way it does when the world has decided to be honest and cold at once. The wind blew out of the north like a letter from a stern uncle. Jon pulled his cloak closer and smiled into it. Small, and if a crow flying above saw his teeth flash it told no one whose teeth they had been. He looked south once and then put his eyes upon the road ahead, where names mattered less and the work was only the work of riding and of being ready when someone, someday, would need reminding why men had chosen to burn less. In days to come, ravens would carry the script to towers and keeps and to a city of red walls and the ash of 1,000 candles. Men would argue, break, mend, and lie. In days to come, boys would dare in cellars and their fathers would cuff them hard and tell them about a winter day when they almost burned a hall that had already been burned once past all sanity. In days to come, Haleen would walk by his guild house and listen to the way men spoke to him differently, and he would grow thinner, and his beard would go untended, and one day he might throw a jar into the river out of spite and watch it float and not catch, and he would feel cheated by a world that refused his magic the right kind of tinder. In days to come, Howland Reed would put his hand upon a weirwood and say a boy's name in a whisper so low that only the roots would know it, and those roots would carry it under lake and stone and to places where names sleep. But the day that mattered had been the one they had lived already. Harrenhal had not burned. The god's wood had smelled only of old sap and winter. The hall of 100 hearths had held 100 hearts that beat and then slowed as men slept after a hard day's kindness. That was more than a pact. That was a blessing no god had stamped, and no king. That was men deciding together that there is a kind of fire the world does not need. Jon rode, and the road drank the sound of his horse's feet, and the wind carried the fine dust of snow into his beard, and he thought of Winterfell and of the wall and of a woman's kind hand that he remembered only as warmth. He thought of the green he had not seen that day and the red he had. He thought of faces painted on glass and faces cut into wood and faces that had learned to wear calm when confronted with cleverness. He thought of all the things he would fail to do and of the one he had done. He did not think of a crown. He thought of a hearth. He thought of a child who would someday sit before one and think all fire was the same. He hoped that child never learned otherwise. He hoped that child grew into someone who found such pacts boring, ordinary, unworthy of songs. Ordinary is what safety wants. Behind him, Harrenhal's towers made more sense under snow than they had under fog. They looked less like teeth then and more like old fingers splayed open, empty. No curse whispered in the wind that morning, or if it did, it found Jon's ears already full of other vows. The gods I lay quiet, and the isle watched, and some tree older than men's crowns kept a memory that perhaps would matter when men forgot. The peace of that day did not have a sound. It had an absence of one. In that absence, the world made a small promise to itself that it would try not to eat its own hands for a while. That is all a pact is. Not an end to hunger. Not a prettied lie. A promise between men that for a time, for a little while longer, we will not make feast of our worst cleverness. Jon made that promise and rode north beneath a sky that would not choose between blue and steel. He did not need it to. He had chosen enough. He could let the sky be greedy. And as the road turned and the lake slipped from sight behind a knoll and the ruin went back to its own brooding, a boy with a basket of rushes in Harrenhal's yard began his day by choosing to light lamps whose flames were tame. He would carry them under his arm as a mother carries bread, and he would not go down the stair where jars had slept, because some part of him had learned a new kind of fear and he had not grown old enough yet to call that fear cowardice. He walked into the hall with his basket and the door took him, and the morning was only morning, and the day smelled of broth and damp wool and the cheap ale men would drink with their dinner. A raven flew, black against the lightning, toward the south. The bird did not carry fire in its beak. Carried ink, the better of the two.